So we'll go ahead and get started. And just wanted to, for those who just entered the room, welcome you again to our ATMOPAV webinar. We're glad so many of you were able to join us for our first one last month with Bob Lachelle, who did some awesome and creative tools with Desmos. So just before we get started, my name is Steve Fugay. I'm one of the board members for ATMOPAV, and I'm just going to be the moderator tonight. So you probably won't hear much from me after this initial talk. I just wanted to let you know, just so that you can navigate and interact with Dan and other participants, that down on the bottom you'll see there's a chat feature, which should bring up the running chat that we have going on right now. People are sharing their Twitter handles right now, so if you're on Twitter, that would be pretty cool for us to connect. And just make sure when you send your message that in order for everyone to see it, if you click on all panelists and attendees under the two, then everyone will be able to see and be able to interact. Otherwise, I will be kind of Dan's second pair of eyes. So if there's any good questions or whatnot that you throw down in the chat, I'll be sure to field them and kind of be able to let him know what questions are coming up as we're going through everything today. But without further ado, I wanted to introduce our president of ATMOPAV, Nancy Kraft, who will just say a couple quick words, and then we'll get the show on the road.
Thank you, Steve. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. As Steve mentioned, tonight is ATMOPAV's second virtual professional development offering this spring, and I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Dan Kaufmann. Dan is a Google for Education certified trainer. He currently works as a K-12 instructional technology and math coach at the Wilson School District in West Lawn, Pennsylvania, where he serves 5 elementary buildings, 2 middle school buildings, and the high school. Working in a one-to-one environment with Android tablets in grades K and 1 and Chromebooks in grades 2 through 12 has given Dan the skill set to work with administrators and teachers of all grade levels and subject areas. Prior to his coaching position, Dan spent 8 years in the secondary mathematics classroom and still serves as the mathematics department chair for grades 6 through 12. Dan's passion for instruction, assessment, effective technology, integration, and leadership has given him the opportunity to present throughout the country and at conferences such as ISTE, PCTM, and PETE&C. Please join me in welcoming Dan Kaufmann, and thank you, Dan.
You're welcome, Nancy. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks, Steve and Bob, everyone else for putting this together. So there are, in that introduction, there are a lot of technology pieces. I'll say as we go through this presentation, there's no huge technology pieces. It's not like Desmos or something like that, where there's like this big wow. It's more of a philosophy or style of preparation, I guess, to hopefully, maximize your results with both your instruction and your the learning of your students. Okay, so I am going to share my screen, and as Steve said, post questions. I'll stop, and Steve, by all means, if I don't stop long enough or there's a question that's related to a specific slide, feel free to interrupt me. Hopefully, can somebody just give me the nod that they can see my screen?
Yeah, we had a few people in the chat saying they can see it, so I think we should be good.
Perfect. Okay, so this presentation is available if you want it at ltsc.scmath.org. And not that you have to follow along, but just know that as I go through this, any of the resources that you see are mine. Please feel free to use, email me or send me a Twitter, a message or something on Twitter. I can get you the resources. We're going to look at some of my old tests and things like that. Please, please, please. The idea here is that we just share our learning. So by all means, do that. And we're going to get going. All right, so once again, Daniel Kaufmann. I'm the instructional math coach. I think this is my 14th year in teaching, something like that. I kind of get lost there. But then my daughter, Piper, she's on the left there. She's 5, and she's in kindergarten, and she just learned to ride her bicycle without training wheels yesterday and today, which has been huge. And then there's Lila. She's 7, and she is in 2nd grade. And then my wife, Quinn, she teaches 3rd grade at Boyertown. So I work at Wilson, my wife works at Boyertown, and our girls go to Wyomissing. So we've got this mixture of 3 different districts going on, with different content, different ways of pushing out material and things like that. If you need to get a hold of me, the website that I run along with Chris McCaffrey is scmath.org. I have a lot of resources there. Feel free to take any or all of them or none of them. My email address is dan@scmath.org, and there's my Twitter handle. And these are all just links that go out to those places. All right, let me go back here. So we're talking about learning targets, leveraging learning targets and success criteria to empower students to self-report their grades. That is a mouthful, all right? And before we get to any of that, we need to go back, reverse, right? In November, I presented a webinar with the Global Math Department on assessing for understanding. And for this webinar that we're going to do today, this piece needs to be in place for it to be successful, this assessing for understanding. And when I started teaching, I was teaching by the book, if that makes sense. I would open up to lesson 1, I would make some notes, and I would present that the next day. The next day I would do lesson 2, lesson 3. I was always planning one day ahead. And then by the test, I was like, oh, I gotta put a test together. I would put a test together, all right? The problem with that is if, I call this mama bird, baby bird instruction. I was taking the content from the book and chewing it up a little bit and then giving it to my students. The problem is if you look at textbooks and the way they're organized, a lot of them start with things like define, and then some formulas, and then some of these problems that are like depth of knowledge 1, all right? Solve, graph, use a formula, and then towards the end of every lesson, that's when you get to these depth of knowledge 2 and 3 questions, where you get to those word problems, where you have kids describe, explain, compare. The problem with my style of teaching is I normally didn't get to these depth of knowledge 2 or 3 questions, and to be honest with you, I didn't mind it because I knew that's where kids were going to start to push back. So this whole idea of assessing for understanding is saying, hey, we value these depth of knowledge 1 questions, but when we look at our assessments, are we asking kids to do depth of knowledge 2 and depth of knowledge 3 types of questions? Are we asking them to show a conceptual understanding, or are we living just in the procedural? And when I looked at my test, and we'll look at one of my old ones in a little bit, I was living in this procedural part, okay? The problem with procedural parts is that there's tools that do that for us. There's calculators that do that for us. What we want to get is at the kids thinking. And I relate this to like baking, all right? If you took a class that was on baking brownies and all they did was show you how to follow the recipe on the back of the box, you would be disappointed. You want to learn how to combine ingredients. You want to learn how do I make these cakey brownies more fudgy other than just taking them out of the oven early, because that's not how you do it, all right? Kids are taking math class. We want them to be working in depth of knowledge 2 and 3. And if you change your assessments to reflect that, then your instruction also has to change. But if your assessments live here, depth of knowledge 1, that's all you got to teach, all right? And there's a lot of tools that do that for us, like IXL, Khan Academy, things like that, all right? So here are some examples. And once again, this was all kind of back in that old webinar. Something like graphing a system of inequalities on the left there. That's a great problem. Kids should know how to do that. But they should also know how to explain how we know the 0.05 is not a solution. They should know how to describe how you could change the first inequality so that there are no systems. All right, and if we look at the example on the right, which is more 4th or 5th grade, adding fractions, what would happen? Could kids answer the question, explain why the sum decreases when the denominators increase? Or what if we asked them to convince us that 1/6 plus 1/2 equals 2/3? All right, they probably have to show some kind of a drawing. So the last slide for this kind of review is the depth of knowledge of your question is tied to the depth of knowledge of your feedback. So when we ask questions like solve, the type of feedback you're going to give to kids is procedural. Where if you ask kids questions like describe, your feedback is going to be more conceptual. So going back to the baking thing, if you're following the recipe on the back of the box, my feedback is going to be, well, how much butter did you add? Where if it's more conceptual, I might ask, well, why did you ask that much butter? What do you think would happen if you added more butter or less butter? All right. So new stuff for today. Do kids know the road they're on? As a teacher, when I first started teaching, I didn't know the road I was on. But if you ask your kids, hey, what are you learning today? Why are you learning it? Do you know if you're going to be successful? Do you know what it looks like to be successful? How would they answer those questions? And that kind of gets at the heart of this teaching with clarity and learning targets and success criteria. So for today, our learning target and success criteria are the following. Today, I'm learning about teaching with clarity to empower students to better understand and evaluate their learning. I can describe the difference between learning targets and success criteria. Given an assessment, I can create and implement learning targets and success criteria. And then also, I can describe how to leverage formative assessments to support the self-reporting process. All right, so at the top, we have our learning target, and then we have those 3 pieces of success criteria. So you guys are going to know at the end of this, if you can do those 3 pieces, then that you are successful. A lot of this comes from the work with John Hattie and Dr. John Almerode. They did their meta-analysis and they came up with these effect sizes. So they combined a whole bunch of data and they were looking at things that impact student learning. All right. And I've gone through a lot of this work with my colleague, Steve Rhodes, who's like the science half on the math side. And these are some of the big pieces that come from that research with John Hattie. Anything with an effect size of greater than 0.4 would equate to more than a year's worth of growth. So when we see teaching with clarity, which is using learning targets and success criteria, we have an effect size of 0.76. We see that self-reported grades are very high at 1.33. That's really high. Feedback is at 0.64, and student expectations are at 0.68. The thing is, when you start looking at these pieces, and if you click on this book, it'll take you out to a chart that has all these on here. All of these pieces are intertwined. They all kind of mesh together. And one mistake you might see is you say, oh, students self-reporting their grades is a 1.33. If I do that in my class, my kids are going to show great improvement, all right? It's not the case. Self-reported grades is not, hey, Dan, how do you think you're going to do on the test? I'm like, I think I'm getting a 76. That's not what self-reported grades are. Self-reported grades are, well, based on, I might say something like this as a student, maybe. I don't know if you'd get quite this answer, but I'd say, based on the formative assessments that you've given me and how I performed on those, I think I'm about a 75%. There's still these 2 pieces that I'm unsure of, and I'd like to work on those before the test. All right, that's what self-reported grades would look like to get that kind of impact. All right, so these are the steps we're going to take today. We're going to make some assumptions here. This first step here, the standards and the curriculum and the summative assessments, we're going to assume that you guys have all of that done and taken care of. You guys have looked at your standards, you're teaching the right things, you've looked at your curriculum, you've developed curriculum, and then also your assessments are good assessments. They're quality assessments that assess for understanding, both procedural and conceptual understanding. All right, and now we're going to dive into the learning targets and success criteria. This is just a different way of seeing that same chart. This is the Understanding by Design UBD framework, where in the red, that's our curriculum. That's the part we already have done. All right, in the blue, that's our assessments. And then in the green, this is the teaching and the learning. This is where your learning targets and success criteria are going to exist. All right, so what's the difference here? And I hear a lot of verbiage, learning targets are this or they're not that. Please know that there's no like super right answer or super wrong answer. It's just the idea of exposing your kids to this types of things, because I know some districts use essential questions. So the learning targets are simply, what am I learning and why am I learning it? And our one science, the head of the science department will always ask that question. I better be able to walk into your classroom and ask your kids what they're learning and why they're learning it. And sometimes I'll keep using this science reference. Kids will say, well, we're doing a lab today. Well, that's not what you're learning. That's what you're doing. What are you doing in the lab? What are you learning about? Well, I'm dissecting a cow's eye. So I'm learning about the cow's eye, the anatomy of a cow's eye. Where the success criteria is, well, how will I know that I've learned it? What does success look like? Can you identify all of the parts of a cow's eye? All right. This is where our verbs are going to come in, and you'll see that in a little bit. So what's the difference between these two? Learning targets, they're going to be about the learning, the what, and not the doing, the verbs. All right. The verbs are going to hang out in the success criteria. They guide the learning and include the why. So what am I learning and why am I learning it? Those are the 2 big questions you have to remember. All right, the written in language that students understand. So there is teacher language and there is student language. Make sure we're using student language when we're introducing them to learning targets. They include vocabulary from the standards, and I've worked with some teachers, this is years ago, and I will never forget describing exponents using the terms big number and little number. And I'm like, but they're on the board. They're both really large numbers. We have to use the words base and exponent. That's what comes from the standards. We have to expose kids to that. Vocabulary in math class is tricky. And if I was being honest, I don't think as teachers we spend enough time on vocabulary. We kind of assume they know it. You know, when kids confuse distribute and factor, and we say, no, you mean the other one. Like, no, we got to spend time. There's a huge difference between those two things. And we have to know that difference. And we've been using the phrase, today I'm learning. Now that we've switched to this online learning platform, we're doing math like in a week chunk. So we release math content on a Monday and the kids do that for the entire week. So now we've changed that verbiage to this week I'm learning, but it's just an easy way to start those. As far as success criteria, this is going to be used during the formative learning cycle. So throughout your lesson, say, hey, are you successful in this? If not, I'm going to check in tomorrow. I'm going to check in a couple of days, and let's check to see if you are successful. They must be specific, understandable, and visible. So you can post these on the board. You can put them at the beginning of your notes. I'll show you in a little bit how I put them in my lessons. All right, so kids should know and should be able to see what success is going to look like with their content. They describe expectations of the learning and the work. We'll talk about that in a little bit more. All right, and they provide students with concrete ways to know if they've met their target. So this is the verbiage we use here for success criteria, is I can. As a student, I can do this, but if you can't, then you're not successful. So this is, we use that term, I can. And the verbs determine the level of rigor. And this is kind of like the same as depth of knowledge. We'll look at a verb chart next. And then lastly, the verbs are written to indicate proficiency, but can be modified to differentiate. So let's take a look at some verbs and see what this could look like.
We have one quick question from the last slide, Dan. Sorry to interrupt.
No.
Asking what the difference is between learning target, learning intention, and learning objective.
So I think actually Hattie in his work uses learning intention, I believe. As a district, we've always just used the word learning target, so we just went with learning target. I don't think there's much of a difference in any of those. You start splitting hairs. I just stick with the main piece there is what am I learning, why am I learning it, and then the success is how will I know that I've learned this. So I know some administrators get caught up on that. I never do, and to be honest with you, I don't know that I could accurately define the difference between those three of those. All right, so in this last slide, we talked about how your learning target and your success criteria identify proficient. So suppose I'm looking at this chart here in this application column here. I had a verb that was, say, construct, all right? Construct a table of values. And whatever my learning target is, that's going to be like if a kid can construct a table from an equation or whatever, they would reach that learning target. But what you could do, suppose you have a kid, and this is I think a huge misconception that exists, the difference between enrichment and acceleration. A lot of times when kids are supposed to be enriched, teachers will accelerate instead because it's easier. Hey, I'm just going to give you 8th grade material instead of 7th grade. When you enrich, you keep the same learning target, but your verb now jumps over 1 or 2 columns, okay? So instead of construct, they might be developing or something like that, okay? And it works the other way. If you're working with kids that can't reach that proficiency, maybe in special ed or something like that, your verb maybe just goes 1 column or 2 columns to the left. So your learning target can stay the same. And what you do is you just adjust your verb for your students, all right? But the verb that you're using should identify proficiency in that topic. So I'm going to show you 3 examples that are not math related. I don't want to get into the content yet. So here's an example of a learning target. Today I'm learning how a map can be used to find objects. So what am I learning and why am I learning it? All right. And then how will I know I've learned this? I can, as a student, I can follow the paces on the treasure map, all right, and keep an eye on these verbs. I can describe 2 paces north and then 4 east, and I can use a treasure map to give one set of directions to my group's treasure hunter. Here's a middle school example. The learning target is today I'm learning how maps provide information about direction, location, and distance. Success is going to be I can draw a map of the playground, I can use a map to give directions, and I can create a key for my playground map. Okay, so once again, look at those verbs. All right, they're not all, those verbs are really going to set up like what does it look like for a kid to be successful on these pieces. But also as a teacher, now I know I need to provide kids with this learning experience that will allow them to be successful. In the math classroom, if these verbs were all solve, 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 my instruction turns into solve, solve, solve. Most likely I do, you do, I do, or I do, we do, you do. All right, we want to make sure we're using strong, powerful verbs here because it changes the type of instruction that kids are going to receive. And here's a high school example. Today I'm learning about the differences and similarities of Western European countries, and I can use maps to compare and contrast, create a graph, and map natural resources. All right, so those are 3 examples, but you can kind of see how they got a little more challenging as we went through the years. And here's a couple of math ones. These are actually things that I've put together. These are lessons that I've taught. This is 5th grade from Eureka Math. Today I'm learning about decimal and fraction multiplication and how they're related. This is a gripe of mine, I suppose, and I see it from more administrators than anything. They'll say, well, what's the real world application here? And to be honest, I don't need one for this lesson, okay? Today we're learning about decimal and fraction multiplication and how they're related. Maybe tomorrow's lesson will have more real world applications, but not every lesson has to have a real world application. We're just seeing how these 2 things are related because it's very important, and right now we don't have to talk about real world situations, okay? The success is going to be, I can multiply with decimals and fractions accurately, and I can model multiplication with decimals and fractions. And what I'll do is, when I taught this lesson, I posted this learning target and success criteria in the beginning of the lesson, and I always posted at the end as part of my debrief. And as a teacher, I was a horrible closer of lessons. I would say, hey guys, the class will come to an end, why don't you work on your homework? And the class would just kind of fizzle out. Now, by posting this learning target and success criteria in the beginning, at the end, you kind of get to put the bow on your lesson and wrap it up and say, hey guys, by the end of this, you should have been able to do these 2 things. If you can't, that's okay, but come and talk to me, or I'm going to give you this exit ticket and we're going to identify if you can or cannot do those things. And then, as I go through the lesson, I just make sure I reference these different pieces when they come up. All right, here's a 7th grade example, and this comes from illustrative mathematics. This week I'm learning about the likelihood of an event from experiments, so I can make predictions, and I can compare, I can predict, and I can justify. All right, so those verbs are going to set the tone or the expectation of what students are going to have to do in that class. All right. And then lastly here, this week I'm learning about, this is an Algebra 2 example from the Math Visions project. This week I'm learning about rational functions and how to describe them. I can construct a table. I can define the terms horizontal and vertical asymptotes, and I can describe a rational function. Now you'll see that term I can define. When you look, I mentioned this before, but when you look in math textbooks, they always start with terms and equations. I always write my success checklist or success criteria in a way that I'm going to deliver it throughout the lesson, or the way that kids are going to experience it. You don't want kids defining terms in the beginning of the lesson. All right, especially kids that struggle with the English language or not reading at grade level. You want them using kid-friendly language first. All right, so let's talk about graphs. You might say the graph goes up or the graph goes down, and then start talking about, no, we're going to call this positive and negative. All right, you always want to start with kid-friendly language first and then get into the definition so that kids have a way of interacting with that content that's familiar to them, and then you define your term. All right, but if I have this as success criteria, I can define the term. As a teacher, I need to see, can they do that? So I'm probably going to provide some kind of a formative assessment that checks that. Can you define what the term horizontal and vertical asymptotes is? All right, I still remember in college, nobody ever asked me what a derivative was, which it kind of blows my mind. So I'm going to take you back to, this is kind of going back into my old presentation on the assessing for understanding, but this was And algebra, I used to teach algebra 2, and this was a test I would give on absolute value equations. We talked about some assumptions, like our tests are aligned to the curriculum and the standards. This is an algebra 1 test I was giving in algebra 2. All right, that's a discussion for a different day. But this is what I would do. Evaluate, evaluate. You know, if a kid can't get number 8, guess what? They're not getting number 9 either. And if a kid can't get number 10, they're not getting 11 or 12. So what I would do is I'd say, hey, can we get rid of some of these problems that are duplicates? And if we do get rid of some, that kind of opens the door for me asking more questions of conceptual understanding. All right, because if I looked at this test, I would just live in the solve, solve, solve world. Evaluate, evaluate, evaluate. I'd still be living in that depth of knowledge 1 world, which, like I said before, calculators can do that for us. We want to see kids' understanding of the material. We want to get them beyond the brownies in the box, okay? So I rewrote some of this a little bit. At the bottom there I have solve the equation for Q, right? There's still value in kids doing that. But the other question is, explain why when Daniel solves the absolute value of x plus 6 equals 2x, he identified x equals negative 2 as an extraneous solution. All right, so now there's some more conceptual understanding going on there. And, you know, what would our learning target be? Or what would our success criteria be for these 2 questions? And maybe there's more questions within here, but this is something that I've done before. I've written these learning targets and success criteria, and I've changed frequently, over and over again. It's a continuously refining process. And something I came up with was, today I'm learning about absolute value equations, how solutions and graphs are related. Maybe that's our learning target. That might be a little big, maybe 2 days worth of learning, 3. And success criteria could be something like, I can explain what a solution of an absolute value equation represents, all right? I can evaluate absolute value equations. I can solve absolute value equations, stuff like that, okay? So we've talked about learning targets and success criteria and developing those. And I'll keep saying it. I keep coming back to my learning targets and success criteria, and I keep rewriting them. I think I get better at doing it the more I see them. So just know that this process isn't a one and done. You're going to come back, just like if you teach something for 3 or 4 years and you go back and look at your first year teaching content, you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I taught this way, or I can't believe anybody hired me, type of things, all right? You're always going to be refining your learning targets and success criteria and changing your verbs and things like that. So now we have, I'm putting this kind of all together here. We have our standards, our curriculum, our summative assessments. We have learning targets. We have success criteria. The next piece is, well, how do I know what the students know? How do the students know what they know? All right, and you can't wait until a summative assessment to figure that out. So this is where we start to develop our formative assessments, all right, and our lesson plans. And as a teacher, I used to teach AP statistics, and kids would ask all the time for quizzes. I was like, you're not getting a quiz, because they just wanted a way to increase their grade. In hindsight, that was like the worst thing I could have been doing. I was holding them back. I was trying to get through the content so quickly. Quizzes were just going to take so much time, and it's totally the wrong thing to be doing. I should have been giving them more quizzes than fewer quizzes. So how will they know they've learned it? When we look at formative assessments, you have a couple of questions here you want to ask. How many formative assessments are you using, and why are you using them? We adopted Eureka Math for K-5, and they do an exit ticket after every lesson, all right? And I absolutely love it. And the teachers I've talked to, they really like it too, because it's so easy the next day to be like, you 5 kids, come in with me real quick. We're going to go over this problem. They know right away what misconceptions kids have. And as a teacher, I used to walk around the classroom and check in on kids. And, you know, there's kids that you would miss, and all of a sudden you get to the test and they're like, I had no idea how to do that. And those exit tickets on a daily basis were really, really nice. And I would challenge you as a teacher to find a way to do that. I know it's a little bit difficult if you have 150 kids, but I really like the idea of daily exit tickets in some capacity. What are the students going to experience on their formative assessments? All right, how many questions? I'm not a big fan of full day formative assessments. All right, if you're given a formative assessment, 2 or 3 questions, in and out, easy breezy, and be done with it, okay? It's easier for the kids to do small check-ins. It's easier for you to kind of rifle through and give feedback on. What types of questions are you asking in this formative assessment? if your verbs are construct, compare, define, you had better be using those verbs on your formative assessment, all right? Because this formative assessment is going to tell kids, hey, do you know what you're supposed to know? Are you being successful, I guess? Scoring. Are you using holistic scoring versus points? And this is a discussion for a different day, but I much prefer holistic scoring. Holistic scoring is you take a look at the entire problem, and this is maybe a little not the scientific way to do it, but I look at an entire problem and I'm like, the kid really knows what they're doing. They get a 4 out of 4. Or like, you know what, this kid is, they pretty much know what they're doing. They get a 3. This kid's struggling a little bit, but if a little bit of work, I can get them where they need to be. That kid gets a 2. Or like, hey, that kid has no idea what's going on. They get a 1. In the math classroom, and I imagine many of us watching right now are guilty of this, we used to make, if a kid didn't put units on the end of their problem, like they just wrote 6 instead of 6 dogs, we always take off like a half a point. Why is dogs worth half a point? And the answer is just because half the points are easy to work with. All right, I can easily calculate what that would be as a percentage. So I like the holistic scoring versus total points, but ideally on any kind of formative assessment, you really don't want to be grading it at all. All right, you want to give feedback. The research shows that feedback, the kids see more growth with feedback alone than they do with grades, and then they do with feedback and grades. Just give kids feedback. And a lot of us are stuck in systems where we have to give grades, but those formative assessments are they're indicators for both me and the kids about how they're progressing through their content. You shouldn't be putting a grade on that to begin with, all right? It's just an indicator. All right, there's more information there if you guys want to click through those resources. And then, okay, so now I have this quiz. I give back to the kids. What are they doing with it after I give it back to them? Are they looking for their grade? Are they diving through the questions? Are they reflecting up on their formative assessments? You give kids time to reflect and talk about, hey, you know, I didn't get this because of ... All right. And that last bullet there is what happens the day before the summative assessment. For me, when I was teaching, I would give a practice test the day before the test. And it was more of a way for me to say, hey guys, if you don't pass the test coming up tomorrow, it's your own fault because you're looking at one very similar to that right now. And lo and behold, the kids that needed to do the most work wouldn't do it, right? They would just sit there. The thing is, they didn't know where to start. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to work on. I didn't give them enough feedback during the entire chapter. I didn't give them enough formative assessments to say, these are the 3 or 4 things that you need to be working on, all right? So we need to make sure we leverage those formative assessments, but also teach kids how to use them to determine, were you successful with this lesson? It's a skill that kids need to develop. Don't assume that they know how to do it. So how can now, we're at this point where we've given formative assessments and we want kids to self-report their learning. You know, I want a kid to say, hey, Mr. Kaufmann, I've got the majority of this material, but there's still 2 pieces that I don't quite understand enough. I think if I can get those 2, I'll do really well in the test. You know, I'll probably get an A or whatever, whatever that kid would say. So how do we empower students to self-report? All right, the teacher's going to provide learning targets based on the standards and the summatives. All right, do this in the beginning of your chapter, your unit, and do it in the beginning of your lessons. The same thing with success criteria. And I would recommend as a teacher, if this is new to you, develop success criteria. But once you get better at it, there's no reason why you can't have students help you develop that success criteria. You know, work through a project and say, hey guys, so what do you think success would look like on this? And then they could develop with you and they get a little more skin in the game. You're going to then develop formative assessments aligned to the success criteria. And by alignment, I mean the same verbs. And now you have a student-reported success criteria checklist. Give this to your kids to say, hey, this was the learning target, and this is what you needed to be successful. I want you to score yourself on this formative assessment. What did you get? What didn't you get? And I'll open this up and show it to you, but it's not rocket science.
Dan, while that's loading, there's another question on success criteria asking, how do you determine success criteria for students with different abilities?
Yeah, so if so that's a great question. So let's say I have a class with mixed abilities. not accelerated, let's say it's like a third grade class or something like that, you would, I don't want to jump back there. So you try and hold the same learning target, but if you remember this chart that had the different colors and the different verbs in the different columns, what you would do is you would just change your verb. So let's say the verb for proficiency is, this is going to be tough to do off the top of my head. The verb for proficiency is construct, all right? For other kids, you might say, I have these 2 or 3 kids where I know they're not going to get to that level. They just can't get there. Instead of construct, it might be like you use the verb evaluate or identify or something like that. You'd still hold them to that same learning target, but just change your verb up and down that column of the Bloom's taxonomy. Okay? All right, so here I have this chart that I would give to kids. This would be the beginning of the chapter. I'd have them put their name, and you can do this digitally or not. I'd put the learning target here. This would be for the first lesson or the first 2 or 3 lessons, whatever the case may be. And then I have the success criteria. I made 1, 2, 3, 4. Please don't put 6 pieces of success criteria in one lesson. That is way too much, all right? I don't know what the magic number is, but I know that 6 is a lot. So the way that I would read this to kids is that I can evaluate an absolute value function. So if I gave you a formative assessment, how did you do on that? 4 is like knocking it out of the park. 3 is not even close, and 2 and 3 are in between. And then I have a next steps piece here. So what are you going to do next to get yourself to a 3 or a 4? And kids might say, oh, I know that I just need to go back and do a little bit more homework, or I just need to work through I need to work through 2 or 3 more problems, and I think I can get there. Or the next steps might be nothing, just continue to practice, all right? The pre-essay is saying, just before the summative assessment, how do you think you are? So this is me on review day saying, I've got this success criteria. I've got this one, I've got this one, I've got this one. I don't have this one, all right? The test is tomorrow, and I don't know what I'm doing on this. And now, that day, that review day, whatever it looks like becomes very intentional for that kid. They're going to come up and say, hey, Mr. Kaufmann, I'm really struggling with this success criteria. Or for me as a teacher, I might say, hey, small group, anybody that's struggling with success criteria of evaluate an absolute value equation, come back with me to the round table. We're going to talk about this. All right, so that review day becomes very intentional now, all right? And that's what review day looks like. And you can even have kids rank questions. Say like, hey, I really know this one. I don't know this one. Oh, I really have no idea about this one. And you can have kids rank them on their level of success or preparedness. Some things to consider. The teacher role versus the student role. All right, what does this feedback cycle look like? Am I giving enough feedback? As a teacher, I didn't give enough specific feedback to students. And part of this feedback too is, we're probably all guilty of this. The kids that need the most feedback probably get the worst. All right, when a kid's really struggling to solve a 2-step absolute value equation, we just walk them through it. Like, we'll say, well, what do you think would happen if you subtracted 3 from both sides? And then what do you think would happen if we divided both sides by 2? All right, that is bad feedback. But for our kids that probably need the least feedback, we'll ask them really good questions. Well, how would you do this if that was a fraction? Or what would happen if the plus sign turned into a minus sign? So please be intentional about your feedback and make sure that the kids that need the most feedback are getting the best feedback and not so much like hand-holding through the content. Self-reporting grades is a learned skill. You have to model and practice this with students. You have to give them the time. I think as teachers, we avoid doing certain things because we just don't feel like we have enough time, all right? And, my pushback is always, I'll pick on Algebra 2. When I started teaching Algebra 2, I would spend 3 chapters reviewing Algebra 1 because my kids didn't know that content. The standards were rewritten to have less content so we can do a deeper dive. And I think some districts were like, hey, there's less content in these standards. That means I can put more material in here and we could really accelerate these kids. The idea is to slow down, do things well, and then you don't have to repeat them year after year after year. Just like this self-reporting, you're going to have to teach kids how to do this. It's going to take time. They won't be perfect at it, and neither will you. But with time and consistency, you will all get better at doing it. And then you have to provide opportunities for recurring exposure and self-reporting. So is your content cycling over? All right. Are you giving kids, spaced learning over time? We know that kids forget stuff. All right. Are we re-exposing them to that material 6 weeks later, 10 weeks later? All right. Are we doing interleave practice? Interleave practice is this idea of if you do a review test and section 1's at the beginning and section 2's at the next part and section 3's the next one, and your test kind of follows your lesson plans, we want to mix those problems all together so that kids have to think. They're not like in the addition section, and so they know just to add. And I see that in elementary all the time. Like, we're doing subtraction, so I know I just subtract the smaller number from the bigger number. What happens is that works a lot of time for kids. We want to interleave those problems so the kids have to think about what they're doing and why they're doing it. All right, so this is your task, and you could do this if you want to. I want you to take a look at an upcoming assessment, maybe for next year, your opening assessment to start in the fall of 2020. All right, is it a good assessment? Are you asking questions of understanding, questions of conceptual understanding, not so much procedures? All right, is it aligned? If you're in Algebra 2, are you teaching Algebra 1? If you're in pre-calculus, are you teaching Algebra 2? You need to identify learning targets based on the standards curriculum and then that quality summative assessment. And for each of those learning targets, then come up to what are the students learning? Why are they learning it? And construct your success criteria. All right, how will the students know they've reached their target? Once you have all that done, that is when you start to develop your formative assessments, okay? So, tying this all together here, this is the debrief, this is the bow on the lesson, I guess you would call it. So today's learning target was that you're learning about teaching with clarity to empower students to better understand and evaluate their learning. You're going to know you're successful today. Can you describe the difference between learning targets and success criteria, right? What am I learning? Why am I learning it? Versus how will I know that I've learned it? Giving an assessment, can you create and implement learning targets and success criteria? And then can you describe how to leverage formative assessments to support the self-reporting process? All right, I will stop sharing and I could jump into the chat if anybody has any other questions. Actually, I'll hang out here just in case. Does anybody have any other questions about a slide I should jump to?
If you have a question, you'd rather ask it through audio, you can press the raise hand feature and I'll be able to grant access for you to ask him directly. Otherwise, you can throw it down in the chat.
All right, I'll stop sharing. So someone said, I'm seeing the benefits of feedback only right now in our learning environment. Students post a math activity in Seesaw and there's no grade, but feedback they can revise and resubmit. So this, I feel like we're gonna learn so much in these next coming months. Good feedback, like, oh my gosh, my teacher is actually reading this and they're actually giving me feedback on this. As a student, you're like, yes, 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 that's what I want. It's time consuming though. Oh my gosh, giving good feedback is time consuming. Anything else for the good of the cause, guys? Please, please, please reach out to me if you have any questions. I'm continuously learning and getting better at this. If I were to present this again next year, it might look completely different, but please reach out if you guys have any questions. You're welcome, guys.